This is Jim Cantelon Today Television. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Always good to come your way, friends, and it's great to know you're there. We're studying the Gospels and taking our time doing it, our sweet time. I just don't want to rush it. I want you, as you follow through with me, to have full exposure to all that the Gospels have to say. And I certainly am not an exhaustive expositor, but I do my best. And we'll get right into Mark chapter 6 right after this.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
Now, just before we get back into Mark chapter 6, I just want to make a brief comment about the fact that when you see these promos on the program for WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, this is a ministry with whom I am very closely connected in that, by God's grace, Kathy and I, my wife and I, founded it 20 years ago with a focus, as the Lord led us, to visit the orphans and widows in distress and keep ourselves unspotted from the world, James 1:27. With these marching orders, Psalm 68, verse 5, God is a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows. We felt it was our calling to provide that kind of care for orphans and widows who have no one to care for them, and specifically those who had been impacted by HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've been working on it for 20 years, as I say. And of course, starting there with the HIV and AIDS pandemic, which continues, by the way, to this day, even though you don't hear about it, this exposes to the greater horizon of orphans and widows in general who are desperate, who have nothing, no food security, no one to defend them from rapacious sexual predators. And most of our work is done with vulnerable women. We've even established a safe home. It's kind of a compound in Malawi, one of the countries where we work, for young girls and widows who've been raped. And it's all, as the Lord leads. I don't make a big deal about it, but it's really, really special in that we work exclusively through local churches. And as a pastor, part of my role is to convince local pastors that they need to be involved in the care of orphans and widows and providing volunteers for that work. And we have a whole infrastructure in place where volunteers are going out, putting in hundreds of thousands of man hours every year in caring for the least of these, the most vulnerable, the orphan and the widow, all females in most cases. One of the things that kills me is when we visit orphan-led households. This is where both parents are dead because of HIV, and these little kids are raising themselves. I mean, it just breaks your heart. Anyhow, that's what WOW is about, and JCT, the show you're watching now, is the official voice of WOW. I make no apology for that. I just believe in this work we're doing overseas in sub-Saharan Africa and also now in India, in a very small way in India, but we're growing. And that's what you're supporting, okay? And I'm trying to add value with exposing you to the Gospels, which is my singular focus on this program, the Gospels. I'm also trying to add value by giving you an opportunity to join us in this work of justice seeking, really, for those who've been so poorly dealt with by life. orphans and widows in sub-Saharan Africa and India. So that's what that's about, okay? Just want you to know that. All right, we're in Mark chapter 6. I think we're picking it up in verse 30, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Last time we were looking at John the Baptist and his beheading, and Herod Antipas and his regret for what he did in beheading John, and his fear of Jesus because he thought Jesus was John resurrected. And it's just a sordid tale. But we dealt with that last time. We move on. Verse 30. Then the apostles, this would be the 12, gathered to Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. He said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. Okay? We're going to just take a little break. For there were many coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. So they departed to a deserted place in the boat by themselves. But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him. And Jesus, when he came out of the boat, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. All right. Where do I start here? Let me just back up here for a minute. Whoops, little mistake there. Ministry in general is very energy intensive. Pastors who are watching this program are saying a loud amen to that. Pastoring is very, very intensive for a number of reasons. Number one, because you're trying to expose the scriptures to people, and to expose the scriptures, you got to really work the scriptures. You got to know what you're talking about. In my case, every sermon represented 20 hours of research and study and prayer. You have to take that part of what you do very, very seriously. You've got to have food for the sheep, if you will, every Sunday as you preach from the pulpit. But it's also very high energy intensive because you're dealing with people, and every person you deal with in your congregation is in a different stage of development. Some are new believers, some are older believers, some are kind of lapsed believers. Some don't really care. They're there just because a friend brought them, or their mothers insisted they attend. You have people in various emotional states. Some are happy, some are sad, some are depressed, some are suicidal. You've got those who've just lost their jobs. You've got others who have huge issues with financial mismanagement and or just simply not enough money to get along. You have marriages that are breaking up. You have unhappy spouses. You've got children who are confused and upset because their parents have just split. And in all of that, you also have an essential lack of appreciation for committed Bible study. You know, the Bible should be opened more than just once on a Sunday. It should be opened every day in your life, and you should be spending time with it. So, you know, you're dealing with all that, you know, and trying to bring some peace and add some value and encourage and uplift. And it's little wonder, you know, boy, I know what I'm talking about here. Monday morning, I felt like a wet dish rag. I mean, you talk about being wiped out. My father, who was also a pastor, he modeled taking Mondays off just to kind of recoup. And I did the same throughout the course of my pastoring life. And now in the work I'm doing in Africa and also with you here on television, I have to have those moments of reflection just to recharge the batteries and to be strong so that I got some more value to add, you know, to your life the next time. Well, this was the case here. They'd had a pretty tough time. They had just come back from their first boot camp. The Lord had invested them with authority to deal with evil spirits and also to deal with illnesses, and they had gone out, you know, dependent on local people in the various villages to put them up for the night or for a few days. And they had lived with those kinds of vulnerabilities, those kinds of transparencies, and also dealing with the spiritual world, and also dealing with people who are coming to faith and people who are being healed of sicknesses. And I mean, it's just exhausting stuff that they had been doing. And Jesus himself was always under the gun in terms of pressure from people. So he says, look, let's just get out of here. Let's get out on a boat and let's go over to the far side and take a break, okay? which, sounded good in theory. As I'm describing these things, I'm seeing them. I'm experiencing them. Why? Because I lived there. I lived in Israel for 7 years. I know the Sea of Galilee so well. I've been on it many times. I've been all around it countless times. I know where Capernaum is. I know where Tiberias is. I know where the Golan Heights are. I know where the Jordan River comes out at the southern end. And I've baptized people there. And I just know it, as do my wife and my three children, who are all pastors today and are fluent Hebrew speakers and call Jerusalem their hometown. Okay, so I'm experiencing all this, and I know exactly what's going on here. Jesus says, let's get on the boat and go over there. Now, over there meant about, on an angle, maybe 5 miles as the crow flies, in the boat to the Golan Heights, Golanitis, as it was called in those days. There's mountains there, but there's also some meadows, and there's wilderness there. And so Jesus figured we can go over there and take a break, right? Because they'd been coming and going, Mark says, so they didn't even have time to eat in verse 31. I mean, this is people pressure. This is ministry pressure on steroids. So they departed to a deserted place. Okay, we're on our way. We're going to have a retreat. But the multitudes. Multitudes means multitudes, friends. On one occasion, the biblical record suggests that there were as many as 50,000 people following Jesus on one occasion, to the point where they were trampling one another and injuring one another. No record of deaths, but we're talking about total lack of crowd control. And they're all pressing in on Jesus because he's the great healer, all right? Everybody's sick. Everybody needs a medical plan. They see them getting in the boat. They say, hey, we know where they're going. Let's get over there. Now, they ran. They had to be fairly young to do this, because from the northwest edge of the lake, around Capernaum, beneath Bethsaida, over the Jordan River, where the Jordan comes in the Sea of Galilee, and then over to this spot at the base of the Golan Heights, would be probably 12 miles, maybe a little longer, maybe 15 miles. They ran, okay? They wanted to get there before Jesus got there, so that when Jesus got there, they could just press in on him again and have to heal them. And you could say, Now the disciples, of course, were ticked at what they saw happening. Mark makes no record about how Jesus felt about it, but we're going to see here what happens. It's amazing that when Jesus finally confronted them, he was moved with compassion for them. They arrived before them, came together to him, and Jesus, when he came out of his boat, saw a great multitude, moved with compassion for them, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. A pastor's work is never done. A pastor is a shepherd. That's exactly what Jesus was. We'll pick it up right after this break.
Why dance when you have very little? When you live from day to day with food insecurity, rampant disease, sickness, and death? You dance because your heart is full of love for God and your hope is strong. WOW has come alongside as the hands and feet of the Lord, providing both home-based care and assurance of God's love. You're happy and you've got to dance. Please support WOW. Let's keep them dancing.
So, just to summarize here, Jesus is escaping the crowds. He's worn out. His disciples are worn out. They haven't even had time to eat. They're so busy. They get in the boat going over to the far side of the lake. The thousands of people who were swarming around them see where they're going, and it had to be the younger ones, but it least the younger ones who ran, but they went around the lake and were waiting for them when Jesus and the disciples landed on the shore. That's what's going on here. And instead of saying, no, please give me a break, Jesus is moved with compassion, as we see here, because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. Okay. So he began to teach them many things. When the day was now far spent, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away, that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." Really? They didn't put it that way. They said, "Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" But he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they found out, they said, 5 loaves, 2 fish. Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in ranks in hundreds and fifties, very organized. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves, and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fish he divided among them all. So they all ate and were filled. So they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were about 5,000 men. This, of course, is the famous feeding of the 5,000. This is not the first food multiplication miracle in the Bible. Back in 1 Kings 17, there's a story about Elijah and the widow of Zarephath and a bottomless jar of oil and of flour during a time of starvation. It's an amazing story. And then in 2 Kings chapter 4, there's a story of Elisha who fed on one occasion 100 men with 20 loaves of bread, and there was plenty left over. So, there were a few precedents for something like this, but not on this scale. When Mark says there were 5,000 men there, that's 5,000 men. How many women and how many children would there have been? Most scholars and biblical commentators suggest it may have been as many as twice that amount, maybe 10,000 people altogether. So anyway, they were hungry. Jesus had tried to escape them. They had followed him around the lake. He went by boat, they went by foot. They've come from every quarter, and it wasn't just those who were over on the west side of the lake, but as they ran, other people from other villages saw the running, saw the activity, joined them, and there was a big kerfuffle, a lot of noise for sure. And so who knows how many people came and joined them from other parts of that region as Jesus was still out on the lake in the boat. It's late in the day. He's been teaching them. Mark doesn't tell us what he was teaching them, but the disciples get concerned that there's going to be some food riots here. I mean, these people are hungry and they got to get something. So before the sun sets, let's send them back to their villages so they can either go back to their homes or buy some food, or they're going to starve. Jesus said, "You feed them." What? Hello, Jesus? What? No, he knew exactly what he was doing here. So he sent them out to find some food, and they found 5 loaves and 2 fish. Some little guy had come with a lunch. I could maybe go on here about these nameless people who have a huge impact in the history of Jesus' life. And one of those nameless persons would be this boy's mother, who had packed the lunch for him. But I'll leave that. The little guy gives up his 2 fish and his loaves and whatever, and Jesus says, "Okay, sit them down." So they sit down in organized rows. I don't know who did the organizing. I guess the disciples must have done that, but they're all there, and it says they sat down on the green grass. Now, having lived there for as many years as I did, and having been in that area so often, green grass says to me it was springtime. Israel is basically a sandbox, at least it was, until modern Israel began to plant trees, and they invented drip irrigation, and they started making the desert into a garden, which they have done and are doing. But in the best of times, when you're, I was going to say driving, which of course is what you do these days, but in Jesus' time would be walking. But many times as I drove from Jerusalem down through the Judean wilderness to Jericho, and then up the Jordan Valley to the Sea of Galilee and beyond to where I used to broadcast in southern Lebanon, up beyond the upper Galilee, it would be totally barren because of the heat. But in about the middle of March to about the middle of April, maybe sometimes even till the end of April, as I'd be driving down from Jerusalem to Jericho, those desert Judean hills would be absolutely bursting with color. Not just green grass, but just ablaze with colorful flowers. Why? Because Israel is sort of on a land bridge between Africa and Asia, and it's on the migratory path of hundreds of millions of birds, many of them exotic birds, but they would fly, of course, over that land bridge, and as they're flying, they're, relieving themselves, and what they are relieving themselves of is full of seeds, and it falls down on the Judean wilderness, just sits there dormant, and then usually, not every winter, but usually in the wintertime, January, February, March, there's quite a bit of rain in Israel. The rain's falling on these seeds, and they're germinating, taking root, and about the middle of March, they start to just burst forth with color. Some of the most exotic plants you can imagine, and Israel's very ecologically sensitive. My kids, when they were going to local schools there in Israel, they were inculcated with this respect for nature and for love of the environment, and they would take tours down into the Judean wilderness, and they would take pictures of, and they'd make notes and identify these exotic African plants that just for sometimes a week, sometimes less, would spring up. Sometimes if there were flash floods right down to the Dead Sea, believe it or not, the soil around the Dead Sea would spring forth with flowers. And that was really unusual because all that soil down there is brackish, salty. Nevertheless, because they're sitting down in the green grass, it tells me it's spring. Okay, nice time of the year in Israel, really is. Jesus breaks the bread and blesses it, breaks the fish and blesses it, distributes it. All of these people get fed, and the disciples pick up 12 baskets of leftovers. Why 12 baskets? Because there's 12 disciples. Each of the basket basically is a backpack, okay? We would call it a backpack. And each of them went out with their backpack and pick up garbage. I mean, they didn't want to leave a mess. And each of them filled their backpack. It's an amazing story. It's a miracle, no question about it. It's something that set Jesus apart from any other zealot who had preceded him. It caused consternation, shaking of the heads, fear even among those who were opposed to Jesus' ministry. I mean, how do you deal with a guy who can do this? And yet Jesus did it, and he did it well. And that wasn't the end of it. Let's move on. And this becomes one of the most famous incidents of all. When evening came, verse 47, the boat was in the middle of the sea. Okay, pardon me, I just jumped in there before I should. Immediately, this is after the feeding of the 5,000. This is verse 45. He made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida is not exactly the other side. Bethsaida is on the northeast coast of the Sea of Galilee. So this would be kind of just a slant, all right? They went to Bethsaida while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. So they finally are convinced to leave, the people are. And Jesus goes up onto the Golan Heights, and he's alone. One of those few times in his life when he was able to be alone. And his disciples are on their way to Bethsaida. And from up there, you can see the lake. You can see the whole lake from where Jesus was. And so this little speck down there is a boat. And so he's alone on the land. He sees them, and he sees that they're straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. They would have a sail, but in those days the sails were not designed to sail into the wind. So they had to row into the wind. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And Mark says he would have passed them by. Now, Mark is writing Peter's recollections, okay? And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost. Huh, wouldn't you suppose that? And they cried out. I mean, he terrified them. They were troubled. But immediately he talked to them and said to them, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." He went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased. Now, again, time being what it is, I'm pretty much near the end of this segment, so I'll have to pick it up next time. But this is another one of those miracles. And in this case, it's that famous miracle of Jesus walking on the water. Read it for yourself. And when we get to it next time, you'll be well versed and ready to go. I'll be back with a closer right after this. You know, friends, it's an urgent time we're living in right now with the COVID-19 crisis, where it seems the whole world is locking down. And I just want you to know that there is not only a biblical perspective on all of this, but there's also just something that needs to be said. It's simply this, that God is sovereign, He is omniscient, and He has factored all things, good and bad, into His plan. I want to direct you to two websites, wowmission.com and also jimcantelontoday.com. There, for the next several weeks, I'm going to be doing some teaching on righteousness and justice and the COVID-19 crisis. It'll be purely biblical. It's something you'll want to watch. wowmission.com, jimcantelontoday.com. I'll be looking for you. Friends, I'm writing Cantelon's Casual Commentary, and I am making it available to you in segments, tranches as I call them. These four represent Matthew. This is the first half of Mark. I'm now ready to release the second half of Mark. It's slow going, but it's well worth it. A little thing like this, it's altogether, Matthew's about 120 pages, but it's very comprehensive. I've really worked hard to give you as honest and as good an exposition as possible, and it helps you with your overall Bible study. And something like this, you can just tuck in your Bible, or you can put it in your pocket, or you put it in your purse, and it's very portable. Cantelon's Casual Commentary. When you support JCT or WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, ask for it, okay? And we'll send it to you. You'll enjoy it. Thanks for watching. See you next time.